even create a branching pattern? Well, actually, there's a way, and that's what we call tree construction methods. Unfortunately, we can actually create a lot of equally valid branching patterns for the same taxa and the same characters and character states. So among those equally valid trees that we can construct, which one could best represent the evolutionary past or the evolutionary relationships between our OTUs? In that case, we select that one that would best represent. But how do we tell whether it actually best represents the evolutionary past of the OTUs? Well, we also have, luckily, techniques in tree selection, okay, or methods in tree selection. Okay, so basically it's divided into two. How we create the tree based on the data that we have. What we do is we transform before our data. Again, what are those data? Taxa, character states. Before they can even be transformed into a tree, they need to become incorporated, or they need to be transformed into what we call a matrix first. Okay, meaning it's a matrix of the taxa and the characters. Okay, based on that matrix, we now group together those taxa or those OTUs that actually have more similarities in terms of character states than the others. And then based on that grouping, based on several groupings, we end up creating slowly, gradually, a tree. But yeah, like I told you, we can actually end up with so many trees that are actually valid, like equally. So which now do we choose as the best tree that would best explain or best represent the evolutionary relationships between the taxa? Well, we have selection methods, and we have three so far. We have parsimony, one of the most used. Simplified methods of tree selection. We also have maximum likelihoods, kind of like more advanced. And we have Bayesian analysis or Bayesian inference, which is so far the most advanced method of selecting the tree, the best tree that would represent the evolutionary past or evolutionary relationships across the OTUs that we have. Okay. We start with a matrix and tree construction. So like I told you, once you get your taxa and once you have your characters and character states, you organize those data into what we call a matrix. Essentially, we list down the taxa in rows, and then we list down the characters in columns. And then we fill each cell with a character state that we assign to that taxon or OTU based on that particular character. Okay? For example, in this case, we have three taxa and then outgroup. We have probably more characters, but in here are shown two characters only, leaves and flower color. For taxon A, the character state that we assign for leaves, in this case in particular, I think the character state, the character here in particular would be leaf phyllotaxy, meaning the leaf arrangement along the stem. In this case, for taxon 1, we assign, for example, opposite. If the leaves are opposite, then we put opposite in this cell. If for taxa 3, with taxa 2 and 3, we see that the leaves are actually alternate along the stem, then we put alternate in that cell. Same is true for the flower color. Okay, that's for morphological data, like data based on the features or the form, the outward appearance of the plant. But molecular data, for example, actually they're pretty more straightforward. You don't have to have many states because there are essentially just 4 states. It's just really the 4 nucleotides, and but then each character is supposed to be a nucleotide site. Okay, it's a site across a long gene. Okay, so in this case, you have site 1 right here, you have site 2, site 3, site 4, so on and so forth. In right here, all the taxa have the nucleotide adenine in site A. And then all taxa have the nucleotide cytosine in site B of the gene, except the fourth taxon. In the third character, which is the third nucleotide site, all have the nucleotide cytosine except taxon 4 and taxon 6 and taxon 7, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's how we create matrix out of the taxa and the characters and the characteristics that we have. This is what we call the process of matrix formation is done. So once we have the matrix, once we have the matrix, we essentially, the next step is to code the character states, meaning to transform them into numbers, usually integers, like whole integers. That is, especially that is true, especially if we have many characters. So these are just 2 characters, but imagine if you have 200 characters that you want that you describe by which you describe different taxa, and there are only 3 taxa here. What if you have 300 taxa with, for example, 300 characters? That's gonna be a pretty huge matrix. Like, how are you gonna make sense of all those details, those information, if you have a lot of words inside the cells or a lot of letters inside the cells? So what we do after creating the matrix is we code the character states. Okay, we transform the character states into numbers or integers. Okay, be it morphological data or in this case molecular data. And so especially for big data sets like those with bigger taxon number and bigger character number, you may need the help of actually computers to make sure that they are analyzed more efficiently. Okay, and so a requirement for these computers to be able to read our data is that we need to transform them first into a coded matrix. It's not enough that, like many computers would, what if it's a computer that doesn't necessarily understand, for example, English language, or maybe there are some character states that are not necessarily used in conversational English, for example. They're pretty much a technical term, for example. So it is easier to just transform all of these character states inside the cells into whole numbers or integers. That's what we call coding. So after matrix formation, we code the matrix. Okay. The concept is, so sir, how does a matrix become a tree? Well, later on we're gonna see how that's done. But the concept really here is that the more similar the codes are across OTUs, the more likely they are going to be clustered together in the resulting phylogenetic tree later. And the more different the codes are from one another across OTUs, the more likely they're going to be dispersed or distributed far from one another in the resulting phylogenetic tree. So that's essentially the concept of tree construction later on, based on the coded matrix. Okay. So, that essentially implies that we have an assumption here that the differences in the character states across different OTUs essentially reflect the changes that happen in those characters. In those character states throughout time. That means that those differences in character states that we interpret as changes in the character states that happen through time essentially may be also treated as the distance of similarity or dissimilarity across these OTUs through time. And essentially, that's what we call evolutionary distance. Like how close or how far OTUs are going to be from each other based on the character state changes that happened throughout their evolutionary past, okay? Which we essentially consolidate into a matrix, specifically a coded matrix. Okay. So yeah, essentially in building a tree, we need the data, but we transform the data first into a matrix, and then we make sure that the matrix is coded, okay, to be understood and efficiently analyzed by a computer, okay, to build the tree. Okay. Okay, so just a clearer example maybe, or a specific example maybe of how we build a character, a matrix out of, again, what, the taxa and the characters and the character states. So for example, in here we have 5 OTUs. Okay, essentially that's our in group. Our in group consists of 5 OTUs, and then we have an out group. And so we have, so aside from the taxa, what is the other major element in creating a phylogenetic tree? We, aside from the taxa, we have the characters. Okay, so the characters, we put them as columns in our matrix. So in here we have 6 characters, and we have different forms of that character across the different OTUs in the out group. Okay. So for example, for character 1, which is leaf shape, and then we examine, for example, OTU 1 to 5, and during the outgroup, and we see that there are 2 forms of leaf shape. It could be elliptic or linear. Then we can and then we do the same for the other characters, and then again the character. This is what we call a character taxon matrix, by the way. But remember, before we can even make them a tree, we need to make sure that they're coded first. So instead of putting these names, we just simplify the matrix into this form, wherein the leaf shape, for example, is represented by character number 1. And then the different forms of the leaf shape, or the alternate forms of the leaf shape, are essentially represented by codes 0 and 1. Usually we assign 0 to the character state exhibited by the outgroup. So in this case, if our outgroup shows an elliptic leaf shape, we assign 0 as the code for elliptic leaf shape. And then for the other leaf shapes, although there's just one other leaf shape right here that's linear, then we assign 1. If we have more than 2 forms of the same character, for example, for character 5, that's stamen number, we have as many as 3 forms. So we have 2, 4, and 5 stamen numbers. So again, the character state exhibited by the outgroup, which is 5, is assigned 0, and then the other 2 forms of the same character are assigned 1 and 2. In this case, 1 is assigned to 4, and then 2 is assigned to 1 is assigned to 4, and then 2 is assigned to 2. Okay. So sir, we have a coded matrix. How do we even make a tree out of a coded matrix? Well, we now take a look. Remember the concept? Essentially, the premise is that the more similar the codes are, the more clustered those OTUs are going to be. And the more different the codes are, the more distant the OTUs are going to be throughout the phylogenetic tree. In this case, we would say that if you take just a quick look at the codes in the character in the matrix, in the coded matrix, you can see that you know what, X nigra, X purpurea, and X rubens, at least based on characters 1, 2, and 3 muna tayo ha. Don't take a look at 4, 5, 6 muna. So based on characters 1, 2, 3, you can deduce that X nigra right here, X purpurea, and X rubens actually are more similar. They're actually similar. They have the same character states, at least for characters 1, 2, 3. So we can show here in the first 3 that we can come up with from this matrix, that you can actually group together a cluster X nigra, X purpurea, and X rubens at one node. Okay. And so just to make sure that we know why they are grouped together, well, that's because of character 1. They all have, for character 1, they have what kind of leaf shape? Linear leaf shape. Okay? So in this case, we say that linear leaves essentially changed or transformed from another form, which in this case is what what the outgroup usually exhibits, which is in this case elliptic. So in this case, what we can the way to interpret this tree is that at this point, remember there's a time element in the phylogenetic tree. At this point, the elliptic leaf essentially transformed from being elliptic to linear, and that linear leaf was inherited by all members of the three in this case, all three species, okay, Ex nigra, Purpurea, and rubens. Same is true for character 3, wherein the five petals of the outgroup essentially transformed into 4 for all three species, Ex nigra, Ex purpurea, Ex rubens. So essentially, these are 2 characters that unite all 3. Okay, how about alba and lutea? At least for characters 1, 2, 3. Don't take a look at characters 4, 5, 6 muna. For characters 1, 2, 3, in this case, they are less similar from Ex nigra, Ex purpurea, and Ex rubens, but they're not necessarily we cannot lump them together yet kasi they also have different codes especially for which character 2, right? Iba si Ex lutea. Ex lutea has a different character state for character 2. Okay, so in this case we can say that maybe Ex alba and Ex lutea are closely related to each other, but we need more data. At least but we know that Ex lutea is different from Ex alba for sure, based on character number 2, which is plant habit. We know that because in here, Ex lutea is the only one across the OTUs that has an herb plant habit. So we say here that all of the OTUs are shrub except for Ex lutea, where the shrubness essentially transformed into being an herb. Okay, in this case. So, but how do we know how lutea and alba are related to each other, and which ones among nigra, purpurea, and rubens are actually more closely related to one another compared to the rest? Well, then we take a look at more characters. Like, the more characters, the better. So we have characters 4, 5, 6 here. As you can see, if we take a look at Ex nigra, purpurea, and rubens, now we can see that between the 3, it's actually Ex nigra and Ex purpurea that have more similarities. Okay, because at least based on character 5, which is stamen number, that means that both Ex nigra and we can see here that both Ex nigra and Ex purpurea have 2 stamens, and probably that transformed from well, in this case 4 stamens, because that 4 stamens is something that unites all the other 3 species, like Ex rubens, tama ba, has 4, Ex alba has 4, Ex lutea has 4 as well. Okay, although all of the members of the in-group have different stamen number compared to other outgroup. In this case, the outgroup actually had 5 stamen number. So we say here, we interpret this as 5 stamens essentially transformed into being 4 and was inherited by all 5 members of the OTUs. However, at this point in the evolutionary tree, that 4 character state was reduced further to just 2 and was inherited by Ex nigra and Ex purpurea. That's why we see only 2 stamens in Ex nigra and Ex purpurea. How about the other characters? Maybe character kasi that's character 5. How about character 4? For character 4, we can see that, that's something that unites Ex lutea and alba together. If we're not able to group alba and lutea firmly earlier, because they may look similar, but they're still different. Based on characters 1, 2, 3. But based on characters 4, 5, 6, we now find that, at least based on character 4, you know what? Lutea and alba can actually be clustered together. Okay? Because in here, for character 4, Ex alba and Ex lutea share a common flower color, which is red. Okay? So in this case, we say that red flowers were transformed from yellow, which is the case for the rest of the in-group as well as the out-group. Okay, so it's only in Ex lutea and Ex alba that the color of the flower changed. Okay, in this case from yellow to red. How about character 6? Well, if this is the tree that we have so far, probably character 6, it is not something that will group together ex alba and ex purpurea, maybe. But just because it's just really one character compared to the other characters that actually unite more strongly the other groups. So we can say that maybe that's not a very good character, but it tells us something about the transformation between a smooth pollen surface to a spiny pollen surface. It just means that that is not necessarily something that was inherited from a common ancestor. In this case, the spiny pollen was just really maybe a product of a mutation in X alba, and that's also the same in X purpurea. But that doesn't tell us that X alba and X purpurea share a more recent common ancestor compared to their other closely related species. Okay, meaning the other characters in this case still outweigh the grouping that can be made, that could otherwise be made by character 6. Okay. This is a very this is a very good example of how we transform character taxon matrix to a coded matrix and then into a tree. But these are just what, 5 taxa and 6 characters. In reality, in many phylogenetic analyses, we actually use more taxa because we want to study more taxa, and we use more characters to be able to sort these taxa to their group, into their groups. And also, these are just morphological characters. Remember, there's another type of character that we usually use, and that's actually more conserved and more, like reliable in terms of like grouping plants together based on evolutionary history. And that's molecular data. And imagine having many taxa with, and usually genes that which we're using to generate to group plant groups together. Usually genes are made up of several nucleotide sites, like hundreds of nucleotide bases. So that means that in reality, like in more in real life phylogenetic analyses, we actually get to have bigger matrices, and then therefore bigger coded matrices, and therefore more complicated branching patterns. Okay. Okay. So, all right. Let's talk about them slowly but surely. Okay, so that's for morphological data. How about for molecular data? For molecular data, like I said, it's just the character states are more straightforward because there are only 4 character states. It's just either A, B, C, or G. And the characters essentially we treat each nucleotide site as its own character, as a single character. In this case, if you have taxa XYZ, and then you have 3 codons, meaning you have 3 nucleotide you have 9 nucleotide bases all in all, and then you align them, make sure that they're properly aligned. You can see here that taxon X and taxon Y actually has 2 they are essentially different at 2 nucleotide sites, or 2 characters essentially differentiate taxon X from taxon Y. And then we can compute the same for the other pairs, like taxon Y and then taxon Z, how much different they are, and then taxon X and then taxon Z, how much different they are. Okay, so meaning if for morphological data, it's actually enough that we transform the different character states into codes. In using more molecular data, yes, you can do that. Like you can just assign 0 to 4, like 0 for A, 1 for G, maybe 2 for T, etc. But that doesn't necessarily inform us of how different the sequences are from each other. Or I mean, it's not necessary because we're usually curious about how many nucleotide bases 2 taxa, by how many nucleotide bases 2 taxa are different from each other. Whether it's actually A that has changed, or G that has changed, or T that has changed, etc., etc. So So instead of creating just a character taxon matrix, a more logical way of making sure, again, the premise is the more different the codes are from each other, the more distant they are in the tree, and the more similar the codes are to each other, then the more clustered they get into the tree. In this case, you can just simply say that well, the more similar the genetic sequences are to each other, then the more clustered they get into the tree. In the tree, the more different the sequences are, then the farther you can see them in the tree. But that closer and farther essentially can be transformed or can be quantified more accurately by measure by coding, by instead of coding the actual nucleotide bases, we count the distances, like how close and how far the differences are in terms of genetic sequence. In this case, yeah, we can just say that taxon X is different from taxon X is different from taxon Y. Well, obviously, in this case, taxon X is different from taxon X by no means. I mean, like zero, because there's just they're the same. They have the same genetic distance, so that's zero essentially. So we don't necessarily add that, so we just leave it blank. But for sure, X and Y has some difference in terms of genetic sequence, and there are two genetic nucleotide sites that are different between the two. For taxon X and taxon Z, as you can see here, there are four different they're different at four nucleotide sites, so we put four there, and then between Y and Z, we have also four differences. Okay, so essentially, this is what we call a pairwise. We measure the distance, meaning the difference, meaning the distance is essentially the difference between the genetic sequences, and we do it pairwise, meaning we compare the genetic sequences of the taxa, two taxa at a time, or two OTUs at a time. Okay. Why do we do that? Well, because the tree that we can make out of this matrix should be based on those distances, on those differences that were transformed into distance. Okay, so in this case, what you can deduce from this kind of matrix is that, well, between X, Y, and Z, Z looks like the most different, or the farthest from the rest. And X and Y are actually more are more closely are more similar, essentially because they are in this case they have less difference. Okay, like they have less genetic distance in this case. Okay, so it makes sense to actually group together X and Y, and then maybe Z is obviously still related to both X and Y, but it is actually farther from either X or Y. Okay, so and we can use that distance to kind of like create the branch lengths. Okay, for our phylogenetic tree. In this case, this length of a branch is 1 unit of genetic distance. Okay, in this case, we say that Z is actually, in this case, how many genetic distance units, quote unquote, is Z different from X or Y? Well, we can see that there are 4 genetic distances. Okay, 4 units, sorry, of genetic distance between Z and then X, between Z and X, and then between Z and Y. But between X and Y, there are only 2 units of genetic distance. So in this case, well, we can say that, if we compare X and Y, there are only 2 units of genetic distance. So that's 1 unit of genetic distance, and then there's another unit of genetic distance that separates the 2. So that's for a total of 2. So that's correct. That's consistent with our pairwise genetic distance matrix. For taxon Z, though, again, it is separated from the X, from either X or Y by 4 units of genetic distance. But there is already a like a genetic distance unit right here for X, and then another genetic distance right here that can link the group X and Y to Z. So, and that also makes sense for the pairwise genetic matrix, because if you compute it, if these are 2 units of genetic distance, and if you want to go from Z to X, you will essentially walk through how many units of genetic distance, 4. So 2 right here, and then another unit of distance right here, and then another unit of distance right here. You get 4 units of genetic distance. That is also true for Y. Before you get to Y from Z, you get to walk through 4 units of genetic distance. So 2 units of genetic distance right here, another one right here for this branch, and then another one to get to Y. Okay, so this is a very very simplified, okay, example of how this is called, by the way, distance matrix compared to the character taxon matrix that is used in morphological characters. For molecular data, we use distance matrix, okay, to simplify essentially the differences between the sequences of the different taxa. Okay, that is if we have only 3. But what if we have 4 taxa or OTUs with a far more complicated genetic distances or genetic distance units? So the easiest way really is just to take a look at the at the 2 taxa that have the smallest genetic distance, meaning they're most likely closest to each other than the rest, at least in the tree. Okay, so in this case, we can see that maybe it's mouse and the fugu. Fugu is a pufferfish. So maybe in this case, between human, mouse, fugu, and Drosophila, it's mouse and fugu that are closer. We're not going to say that they are more closely related yet, because we don't have the tree yet. In this case, we can say that they should be closer to each other, because in this case, they have less differences in the genetic sequence, in the gene sequence. Okay, and so they should be they have, to walk from mouse to fugu. You only need 3 units of genetic distance. That's the point. And then so once you take a look at that, you now have an idea that in your mind, fugu and mouse would be closest to each other. And then Drosophila, in this case, as you can see here, in any of the other 3 OTUs, be it human, mouse, or fugu, it's the units of genetic distance are huge. Imagine 9 to 14 for all across all OTUs compared to Drosophila. So in your mind, you're gonna see that Drosophila could actually be positioned in the phylogenetic tree farthest from either fugu or mouse, or the group that fugu and mouse create. But how about human in this case? If you take a look at the difference between human and Drosophila, that's okay, that's cool. That means that there's a lot of genetic variation or genetic distance. There's longer genetic distance between human and a fly. That's good to know. But if you take a look at the difference between human and pufferfish and human and mouse, there's really no large difference. There is still different for sure, but between the two, there's really less difference. We would say that there is less difference between human and mouse compared to human and fugu, human and pufferfish, which essentially makes sense in reality. So it's just really a matter of where exactly in the tree human could be inserted, in such a way that even if you insert human in the branch, in the phylogenetic tree, the counts of the units of genetic distance would still make sense for all the other 3, for the other relationships, like for the mouse and fugu and Drosophila, fugu and Drosophila and mouse. Okay, so as you can see here, you can easily just insert human right here in the middle, but will that still make the units of genetic distance true for all the other relationships, such as Drosophila x fugu and Drosophila x mouse and fugu x mouse? So as you can see here, the only way by which human can be inserted in the in the phylogenetic tree, while preserving the already established genetic distances between mouse x fugu, mouse x Drosophila, and fugu x Drosophila, is to actually put it closest to mouse compared to fugu and Drosophila. Okay, and so point is, as you can see here, there's kind of like a mathematics involved in the process in making phylogenetic trees. So and essentially you're gonna learn later that it's actually all about mathematics and statistics as well in creating trees and choosing which tree among a set of trees you will actually choose to best represent the evolutionary relationship between different taxa. Okay. 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 So now, that's pretty straightforward earlier. You know, remember for the morphological characters, we only had how many taxa? 5 OTUs for the in group plus the out group, so that's 6. And then for the molecular data, we got some sample 3 taxa XYZ, and then taxa four taxa mouse, human, fugu, and Drosophila, and then some genetic distances. But you know, in real life phylogenetic analysis, we don't just deal with 4 OTUs. We deal with a lot of OTUs, and we deal with a lot of character. We deal, especially for molecular data. Okay, especially for molecular data, we deal with a lot of nucleotide sites. Probably hundreds, especially for genes with hundreds of base pairs, for example. As we get to have hundreds of nucleotide sites as well. So in that case, it's not enough to manually draw the phylogenetic tree that would best that would make sense given the distance matrix that you have, okay, for the molecular data, because it will be very tedious, if not impossible, to actually create all the possible trees that could be made given several taxa and several nucleotide sites. Okay. So luckily, with the advent of technology, we don't have to do that. So that's great. We just let a computer do it for us. Okay, we just let the computer create the best tree that could explain the genetic distances between the taxa as what as appears in the distance matrix. Okay. Okay, so so there's a lot of there's a lot of methods by which computers read distance matrices to produce trees, and we call those techniques or computations. Essentially, the computer is computing for us, like on our behalf. Okay, and there's a lot of computing methods that computers employ. And they're all called clustering algorithms. When we say clustering algorithms, these are computations that instruct that enable a computer to group together taxa that are less different from each other, and therefore they have shorter genetic distance from each other compared to the rest. Okay, but again, if you have several taxa and several nucleotide sites, that would be very tedious. So there needs to be some algorithm, meaning some computations that are already established. Okay, and then you just put the data, and then the computer quickly, computes for you. Okay, so one example of such clustering algorithm or clustering method is neighbor joining. So what it does is, for example, if you have 5 taxa, okay, taxa A, B, C, D, E, okay. And then you have this genetic distance. So you have these distance units from A to B. You have 2. So again, and then so and so forth. It's essentially the algorithm starts with just no assumption of any grouping yet. Meaning they essentially just arise from a common node. But what it does is it finds that those 2 members or taxa or OTUs, it chooses 2 OTUs that could be clustered together because again they have less dissimilarities, they have less differences, meaning shorter genetic distance from each other. Okay, in this case, if you take a look at the genetic distance units right here, you can see that you know what, maybe it's A and B that have shorter distance from each other. Actually, maybe D and E too. You can actually group them together and they will have the same. But for a clustering algorithm to work, it needs to group only two OTUs at a time. Siyempre, isa-isang pair lang naman. So it's essentially pairwise, okay, na grouping. Okay, so how about the algorithm, for example, chooses, oh, I see A and B, they are less different from each other, and therefore they have shorter genetic distance from each other, and therefore maybe they can be clustered together. But how about C, D, and E? That's the next question of the algorithm. Well, the algorithm will compute, oh, if you know what, if A and B are together, they're actually they actually have 2 units of genetic distance from C and 2 units of genetic distance actually no, that's it. It's the closest. Yeah, like it's the least, the genetic distance, because the rest, if AB is compared to D and compared to E, there are 3 genetic distance units. So the algorithm would say, oh, most likely A, B, and C are actually should be more clustered together. How about we group them together? And then the group, the taxa or the OTUs that are joined together are then recomputed in terms of genetic distance from the remaining. So in this case, now the algorithm reaches a point when the genetic distance between A, B, C, and either D or E is just the same. It's just really 2 genetic distance units. Okay, so this is essentially your initial tree. It doesn't really look like a phylogenetic tree at all, like the usual phylogenetic tree that you would see. But later on, you would see how an outgroup could actually be useful in routing, in making sure that there's an evolutionary direction in this particular network. Okay, it's not even a tree yet; it's just a branching network, right? But it's the outgroup that would help us build a tree from this one. Right? An evolution informing tree, okay, for us. Okay. So essentially, that's the algorithm. That's how the neighbor joining algorithm works. Essentially, it joins 2 neighbors together at a time and make sure that the distance between the joined neighbors compared to the other members or the other OTUs, okay, the distances between the joined neighbors and the other OTs are computed a pair at a time as well. Okay, so that's what we call neighbor joining. So the closest or the shortest the genetic distance is between 2 neighbors, the more likely the algorithm will cluster them together first compared to the others. And then of course, at some point, if there are some, for example, the computations give us equal distance for C, D, and D is just like 3 compared to AB. How will the algorithm choose now? Okay, so that's gonna, especially if you have more taxa, right, in here, and if you have more different genetic distance units in the distance matrix, you're gonna end up with definitely completely different initial branching network. Okay, and if you have branching networks that are of equal significance or equal validity in terms of the genetic distance, then a criterion should be used later on to make sure to choose between equally valid networks, or like branching networks. Right? So it's not enough that we are able to create a tree. We need to select which tree will best represent or will best explain or will best represent the evolutionary history or evolutionary relationships between different taxa, between our OTUs. Okay. Okay. So well, like I told you, depending on the number of OTUs and the number of characters that you put in your matrix, especially if it's molecular data, obviously there's going to be a lot. The number of trees will essentially exponentially increase as well. Okay, as the number of taxa and the number of characters increase. So meaning it's hard to choose which one, especially if all of these are valid, if all of these have equal, for example, like genetic distances. If you compute, for example, actually, you know what, like these alternative branching patterns have just equal genetic distances across all of them, which tree do we use now to represent the evolutionary past or the evolutionary relationships between the different OTUs? Okay. And that's why exactly we have what we call selection methods. Okay, so it's not enough that we're able to create a matrix out of our characters and taxa. It's not enough that we're able to code the matrix. It's not for morphological data. For molecular data, it's not enough that we create a distance matrix of our taxa and characters. It's not enough that we, especially for bigger matrices, it's not enough that we let a computer create trees out of the matrices. It's very important that once we get several, especially when we get several trees, and usually you get several trees, actually hundreds, or even millions of trees, especially if you have several arrangements that are possible, like for your, for the kind of data that you have, you're gonna end up with multiplied by 10 to the 10th power even number, or even maybe more number of trees. How do you select which tree would best represent the evolutionary relationships really of the OTUs in your matrix? Okay, so that's why we have selection methods. And right now, the most common ones that you're gonna see in many papers, in many journal articles, for example, in many researches about phylogenetic relationships are three. So the parsimony method, wherein the tree with the fewest number of changes. What are those changes? The changes between character states. Okay, whether it's from a morphological character, meaning, remember, like for example, if the change is from yellow to red, or the change is from 4 stamens to 2 stamens, those are changes. And you can actually count the number of changes in the tree. Now that tree that has the fewest number of changes, of the fewest number of character changes, essentially that's the best tree that could represent the evolutionary relationships between the different OTs that you have, at least according to the criterion set in the in parsimony. Okay, that's what we call parsimony. Next selection method is maximum likelihood. In parsimony, what happens is that you essentially think or assume that one change between 2 character states has the same probability of change in another set of character states. So for example, if, like for example, with our example earlier, if a character state changed from yellow to red, and then a character changed from 4 stamens to 2 stamens. Remember that those characters you can just count, right? The number of changes. Sorry, the number of changes in those character states across the tree. You can count them, and then the fewest, using parsimony, the fewest that tree with the fewest number of changes will be selected as the best tree that could represent the evolutionary history of the OTUs. Okay, that is assuming that the probability of yellow color transforming into a red has also the same probability of having 4 stamens transformed into 2. In reality, maybe there are some characters that actually don't change quite often, or character states that don't change quite often, or there are character states that that change rapidly. Like it can actually, like quickly transform from yellow to red, like in just few, like centuries, for example. And then maybe 4 stamens to 2 stamens, maybe that's very hard, because those are, stamens are male organs, for example. It's hard to lose the 2 more male organs in the process of mutation, the process of evolution. So maybe there are character states, maybe there are character states that actually change less frequently or more rapidly than the others. Okay, and so in that case, fortunately, there are literature telling us which characters actually change quite more often, quite more or less frequently, based on available evidence, of course. Okay, and essentially, if we know the rates of character state changes, then we know then we are given a model. For example, a model of evolution for that particular group of organisms. Okay, so using a model in selecting which tree would best represent the evolutionary relationships between organisms. Essentially, we call that selection method maximum likelihood. Okay, so maximum likelihood method utilizes a model that tells something about the differences in the rates of change between character states. Okay, which is essentially, unfortunately, the weakness of parsimony. Because parsimony doesn't really tell you whether the character states would actually, whether that change is actually probable in nature. What if that doesn't really happen, or that is harder to happen compared to other character state changes? You know, that happens. Like the differences in the probability of state changes may happen depending on the part of the body, the organ of the plant where the character can be found, etc. Okay. So now, for maximum, when you use maximum likelihood as a selection method, you essentially select that tree that has the highest likelihood score among a set of trees with their own likelihood scores. Okay, and then that one tree best represents, you know, the evolutionary relationships between the OTUs. Finally, the most recent selection method that we use in selecting which tree would best represent the evolutionary relationships between our OTUs is what we call Bayesian inference. Okay, so in Bayesian inference, it's instead of so it's kind of like similar to maximum likelihood in that we are considering models. For example, like we agree in Bayesian inference, we agree that, oh, you know what, there are some character state changes that are less probable than the others. And there are others that are, oh, you know what, that actually happens a lot. Like that character state change from one to another happens a lot. So maybe that that would you know, create a more maybe that difference, those differences in the rates of character change may change the way the branching patterns appear in the phylogenetic tree. Okay, so that's similar to maximum likelihood. But in Bayesian inference, it's not just the model that is important, because in Bayesian inference, the model itself, because it's just a model, it doesn't necessarily mean that it happens all the time. Okay, meaning even the model itself is not necessarily considered 100% truth. Meaning the model that we put alongside our data is itself a hypothesis as well. Okay, meaning we want to know how essentially we want to know which phylogenetic tree among lots of phylogenetic trees that we can get from our data are actually have high probability of being the case in the evolutionary past, given this model, which is also a hypothesis on its own. So it's not, you know, 100% sure. So we treat it as a hypothesis as well. And not just that, not just the model of the rate change